Hello, so I thought I'd do a short series of tutorials for Arminator, which seems to be getting quite a lot of interest on the internet, but obviously some people would like some of the features of it explained a bit more fully. So just a short series of videos explaining each section of the synth. So I'm going to start with this area here, which is the oscillators. There's a couple of different oscillators in here which I'll explain about, two filters, and then you have the amplifier section here with this ADSR. So the first thing is I've set up a very simple sawtooth patch here, nothing too strenuous, just a simple sawtooth patch. Now there are two sets of oscillators in Arminator. There's a pulse width modulated oscillator here, and there's another oscillator here which at the moment is set to sawtooth. There is also actually a third oscillator after the filters, which is a sine wave, which can be used for adding a bit of beef to the bottom of the sound. But let's just look at this sawtooth oscillator first. What some people may or may not realise is that this label here, sawtooth, is actually a clickable element. So it's sawtooth at the moment. If I click on it here, I get a ramp sound. Click on it again, I get a different ramp sound, a square wave. Then I've got a peak wave, octave wave, which is almost like an organ tone, and then two more digitally sounding waves. And then a white noise. So that oscillator, I'll take the volume of that one down, and I'll now bring up the volume of the pulse width oscillator here. Okay, so at the moment it's just set to square wave. If I change the pulse width, you hear the effect there. I can also do pulse width modulation on that wave by using the combination of the pulse width modulation amount and the rate. So I turn the modulation up, and then turn the rate up. I believe in the original instrument that I don't need to say that Arminator is based on an original instrument. I think most people can work that out for themselves. The pulse width modulation oscillator was actually referred to as chorus. There wasn't actually a chorus unit on the original instrument as such. The chorus effect was by the use of pulse width modulation. Okay, so what I've done here now is I've added in a little bit of pulse width modulation oscillator and the sawtooth oscillator. So the two are sounding together. Okay, now one thing that I've mentioned here is just the left of these two oscillators level sections here, there's this glide effect. So if I play one note and then play another, and I turn that effect up, you get a glide from one note to another. But while the setting here is in gliss mode, glissando mode, it actually travels a semitone at a time, and then the rate at which it travels from one to the other is determined by the height of the slider. But you can also click on this control here, and then you'll get portamento, which is a smooth transition between the two notes. Okay, so beyond the oscillator section then we have two filter sections. And again here I'm borrowing from the original instrument in that there are two separate filters for each line. We've got a low pass filter here and a high pass filter here. Each filter has its own ADSR, and the ADSR for each filter, attack, decay, sustain, release envelope, can modulate its own filter. So in the middle of the two filters we have also this mix control, which allows you to mix the output of the two filters. So between one and the other. Now the input to the filters is actually hardwired, so both oscillators here are always going to go into the filters, both filters in parallel. It does not operate in series. It's not the low pass filter followed by the high pass filter. They are working side by side, as it were. So what we can do here is, though, if we want to adjust the level going into the filters, then we would do that as I mentioned previously with the two level sliders here. So I'm going to turn down the pulse width modulation oscillator for a minute, turn up the sawtooth oscillator, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate the mix control to the fully to the left, which means that we're only going to hear the result of the low pass filter. At the moment, the frequency control on that is set to its maximum, which means that it should pass the signal through unattenuated by the filter. But as I close the frequency, then you should hear it start to roll off the higher frequencies. And that effect can be accentuated by the use of the resonance control. Okay, now I'm going to move the control fully to the right, and now we'll hear the result of the high pass filter. And again, that effect can be accentuated by the use of the resonance control. So let's move the control back to the low pass side now, and we'll just set a little bit of modulation of the envelope on that filter. So we'll give it a little bit of resonance, turn the frequency down, and you should be able to hear that now as it's sweeping the filter frequency. As you adjust the envelope controls, okay, so I think you can hear that effect. So then beyond the filters we have the amplifier section. Now, as I said before, there is a sine wave oscillator which you can bring in, which is after the filter section. So whatever you do with the filters, the sine wave will not be affected by that. It's a very subtle effect, but one that actually adds some body to the sound. And then the output from both filters, the level of that is adjusted by the screen slider, which is the filter into the amplifier. The amplifier ADSR is again fairly standard attack, decay, sustain, release. I didn't attempt to copy the rather unusual envelope layout of the original. And what you'll notice here is there's quite a lot of places here where you can adjust the level of each line. I've got the two adjustment levels here for the two oscillators. I have the adjustment of the filter going into the amplifier. I have the level of the sine oscillator, and even at the output of the amplifier I've also got a level control here. Now, I know there have been some comments about the really high outputs from this instrument, but to be honest, it's not an instrument where you're expected to run all of these levels anywhere near their top. For me, it was much more important to have the control to be able to bring the levels down. I think at some point I will probably add an overall volume control to the instrument, because I think that's what a lot of people have been asking for. So if I could just take you down here in the mixer section, as well as having the levels here for that line here, you've also got another level control here, which allows you to mix. And while I'm down here, I might as well mention that you can also pan each line left to right, so you should be able to hear that effect, hopefully. Okay, so that's the top line there now. So now let's have a look at some of the goodies we've got below. Now, before I talk about the Arpeggiator and some of this area here, I'm going to talk about the LFO area. The LFO section in the original instrument was very comprehensive, and I've tried at least to try and replicate some of that here. So first thing here is we have the opportunity to sync the LFO. It can be either manual or host sync. So whatever your tempo is of your DAW, if you have it on host, the LFO cycle will be hosted to that DAW clock. But you can adjust the ratio with the use of this control just below. So that gives you the opportunity to adjust that. Now, obviously you're not going to hear that effect unless I turn any of these LFO sections up. And we've got two separate rates here. If you're in manual mode, we've got the LFO rate, which is going to modulate the filters and perhaps other areas, and then you've got the vibrato rate, which is actually only going to affect the pitch of the oscillators. And the amount of vibrato, which can be affected by this slider here, is actually sort of designed in such a way that you can't really drive the oscillators really hard. It will always be hopefully a fairly musical effect. If you did want to have the modulation of the oscillators more extreme, for more extreme pitch effects, then because the destination of the LFO is switchable, you can switch it to various locations, one of which for instance will be the oscillator pitch, either the pulse width modulation oscillator or the sawtooth oscillator, as we call it. Okay, so let's see some of those effects in action. So if I put the low pass frequency as the destination of the LFO, I'm now going to put the LFO into manual mode, so I'm now adjusting the LFO rate with this slider. Okay, and I'm going to turn the LFO modulation up high. I'm going to turn the frequency of the filter down low. Make sure my envelope modulation is down. Okay, and let's hear the note without any modulation. And then let's turn up the LFO modulation amount here. The routing of the LFO is also can be from an envelope. So from the envelope controls in here, attack and delay. It can be via a mod wheel, so the amount of modulation can be controlled by the mod wheel, or it can be direct, so that it will just go direct. Okay. You'll also notice that I have the opportunity to have different waveforms here for the LFO. I've got a choice of sine, sawtooth, ramp, triangle and square. Okay, and also the LFO can also be run in LFO mode, or what we call sample and hold, which is actually a random, which we'll get to in a moment. But let's just put it in LFO mode. I've got it in direct, so now I'll put the rate down a bit. I'll make sure my filters is closed so that this should affect it, and as I now increase, so that's increasing the amount that the LFO is affecting the filter, and then I can affect the speed manually with this control here. That's the sine wave effect. If I go to ramp, for instance, I get a different effect again. So that's fine. So now let's talk a little bit about what I've called sample and hold, because there are a couple of controls here which are important to understand. So if you put it into sample and hold mode, then you've got two sliders here which come into effect, the two blue sliders, and they're used to set the top and bottom range of the randomness of the sample and hold. So I've called it sample and hold here, but it's much more accurate to describe it as a random LFO. It's producing random values as determined by the top and bottom range of the sliders. So if I have the bottom, the blue one at the bottom, the blue one at the top, now if I now close these sliders down, I'll get a much narrower band of randomness, shall we say. So the interaction between the sample and hold, high and low sliders, and the LFO amount is quite critical with it. They are very interdependent, because obviously The LFO amount is going to set how much the sample and hold effect is going to the filter, but by the same token the width of that effect, shall we say, the width of the range between its highest and lowest random number or random value is going to be determined by these sliders here. So a little bit of experimentation there will pay you dividends. It's quite a tricky one to get your head around what's actually going on there, but to say, if you understand that sample and hold effectively means a random LFO values, and then the high and low values affect the width of that control in terms of its range of values, but the LFO amount will also say the amount of those values that's going to the filter. It's quite a nice feature, I feel, and one that I've actually not seen before in another synth, the high and low range on the random sample and hold. So I mentioned a moment ago that we can also change the control of the LFO. So if I have the LFO here set to direct, then as I move these controls I will get direct control of the effect on the filter. Okay. However, I also can set it from an envelope, and then these attack and delay controls come into effect. So if I put the attack, so it's a slow attack, and the release, the decay release to slow, then when I press a key, then I get a slow increase in the amount of LFO effect. Okay, and the other option I have here is to have it from the mod wheel. Now you obviously can't see what I'm doing here because I'm not showing you the where my hands are going, so to speak, but if I I'm actually rotating the mod wheel to get the effect to go. The destination of the LFO, I've got it there going to the low pass filter. It can go to the high pass filter frequency. It can go to both filters if you're running the signal through both filters, of course. It can also go to the amp to give you a tremolo effect as well. Now that effect is in addition to the level that we have here. That's why we have this level control here. So if I was to turn that control all the way down, now I'm now using the mod wheel again. So I get quite a nice tremolo effect, or in that case it's almost like a picky effect that I'm getting there by virtue of me using the mod wheel, which again you couldn't see me doing, but I was rotating the mod wheel on the keyboard that I'm using here. So mod wheel, direct and envelope. So this LFO section is really quite flexible, and as I've said before, obviously bear in mind that the rate of everything that's happening here can either be manually set with the green slider, or again it can be controlled from your host clock frequency. Okay, now on top of that, of course, we do have, as I said before, we have the vibrato. So if I turn down the LFO rate, if I play a note now, I should get a straight note. And then if I turn up the vibrato amount, I'm getting a vibrato amount which is obviously controlled by the vibrato rate here. Now the vibrato amount is never going to go into the extremes that the LFO modulation can. It's always, I've tried to keep it within the bounds of being at least moderately musical, and I think you'll have discovered from some of Armin's patches that a trademark sound of the Greek person that used to be very popular in the use of this instrument was the slow vibrato. He used to often have a vibrato effect in his sounds that was very slowly sweeping, which was quite unusual. It created a lot of movement in the sound. Bear in mind, of course, also that I'm only dealing here with one line. I've got another line down here. So obviously if I had one line without a vibrato effect, one line with a vibrato effect, and mix the two together, then I'm going to get a really nice chorus interphase between the output of the two lines, between the output of the oscillators. And some of the richness that you hear in the patch bank that comes with the instrument is because of that interaction between the two lines and the different settings between each one. Similarly, I'll mention now that the portamento glissando is independent for each line. which is again an important effect. It means you can have a glide between notes on one line, not on the other, which again can give you quite a nice, interesting effect on the attack or the sounds that you're producing. So again, I'm not going to touch on the arpeggiator for a minute. We'll come back to that in a moment. To the right of the LFO, we have a little echo effect. Now this echo here comes before the mixer section, so it's applies on each line independently. The echo is always linked to the host tempo. You can of course adjust it through a high range of tempos by the ratio control here, but it is always linked to the host tempo. So at the moment you have a repeat amount, you have the tempo, which obviously set by that to control there, you have the repeat amount, the number of times the echo repeats, and then you have a level for the echo effect, which is the bottom slider. So if I just play a note here now, let's turn off the vibrato. Now you get no echo effect there because I've not got the level up. If I turn the level up, now I've got it on a really high tempo, or really, you know, a speedy tempo, so it sounds almost like a double hit on the note. If I change that, now that was me playing one note, but I'm getting a delay a long time after the original. So if I increase now the repeat, so you get the idea. Turn the volume down on that for a moment so we don't get confused with what we're hearing. These four controls here are for affecting the filter by virtue of the velocity and by virtue of the aftertouch. And one of my users was kind enough to point out that it is polyphonic aftertouch. I didn't know whether it was or not. I don't have a keyboard that supports that mode, so I wasn't able to test that, but one of my users said in fact it is polyphonic aftertouch, which is very nice to know. So let's see if I can affect the frequency of the low pass filter now with some velocity. So I've turned the filter frequency down. I haven't got the velocity turned up, so no matter how hard I play I'm getting the same effect. So let's turn the velocity effect up. Now you might be able to hear on the mic that as I'm hitting the keyboard harder, the actual filter is opening, and depending on how much I have that effect rolled over, as it were, so that's quite a nice effect. And obviously velocity and aftertouch were a very important feature of the original instrument, so it's critical that we get it here. Okay, time to look at the arpeggiator. And quite a few things going on here, which I shall try and describe. So first of all, the first control here is whether or not the arpeggiator is going to be effectively on or off. There's a sort of a couple of ways to describe this. You can have when you play, it's going to use the keyboard, it's going to use the arpeggiator, which at the moment, because I've got it off, sounds exactly the same for what it's worth, or you can have both, and that will make more sense in a minute when I turn the arpeggiator on. So then if I go to just arpeggiator, below that I have off, I have up, I have down, I have up and down, I have down and up. Try and spot the difference please if you can. And then up twice, down twice, up twice. So let's just stick with the normal up. And I've also got a hold option here. So at the moment the arpeggiator is only going to sound for as long as I keep my finger on the keys. Okay, so then I have hold on. So if I play a note, but rather pleasingly it will change to the next note, so it doesn't sort of, you know, one note doesn't play over the top of the other, over the top of the other, over the top of the other. Okay, now we have, again, you're only available to have the arpeggiator syncing with the host clock. That's the only way you can do it. However, As well as having it hosting to the clock, you can also subdivide the host clock, and that's with this section down here, which is called Arpeggiator Gate Clock. So gate isn't strictly a true description of what's going on here. Some people may think it's a gate effect, which it isn't. It's actually just a way to actually change the pattern of the pulses that are going from the clock to the arpeggiator. And you change between the two with the control here that changes between clock and step. If you have it in step mode, then whether these push buttons are down or up is going to actually determine when it actually fires a pulse into the arpeggiator clock. So if we leave it at clock and I just hit a note, it's quite a fast pattern there because I've got it on quite a fast tempo ratio. But if I put it on to step, you get quite an attractive pattern, rhythmic pattern to the arpeggiation itself. Now I'm only playing one note at the moment, so the arpeggiator is just arpeggiating a single note. As soon as I play a second note, the pattern jumps between the two notes. If I play three notes, and if I play four notes, now what you may have noticed when I had three notes down, if I have three notes down and have a certain step arrangement here, you can get some quite nice sort of syncopated effects and so on and so forth. Now at the moment I've got the arpeggiator just going across a single octave. So as I'm playing three notes here, it just plays those notes across a single octave, but I've got a range of up to 4 octaves. I can go 2 octaves, 3 octaves, and 4 octaves. And obviously it depends on whether you play one note or more than one note, depends on how that octave range sounds. Fairly recognisable stuff, I guess. Again, bear in mind that you've got an arpeggiator on each line, totally independent. So of course if you're using 2 lines, I've got line B turned down here, then you can get some really complex effects. Also of course you can have arpeggiator on one channel and just be playing notes on the other, so again that gives you a nice range of different effects. But as I said earlier on, I can also have it so that I'm actually got arpeggiator or arpeggiator and keyboard. So now even though if I play a note, that didn't sound too pleasant, but I wanted to give the effect that as well as the arpeggiator controlling when a note is triggered, I can also hit a key to control when the note is triggered. And again, people that are perhaps better and more skillful than me at playing will be able to use that effect to some quite powerful results. So that's really the whole section. Obviously something like the arpeggiator starts to sound really good if you mix it in with the echo, and again bearing in mind that they're both tempo synced. So again, lots of fun to be had there. The last effect that I didn't mention in the arpeggiator is the velocity control. So the arpeggiator can be oblivious to velocity, or it can use the velocity, the note velocity. So I'm not sure if that's going to be able to show here. Not a particularly easy thing to show here, but effectively it is affected by the velocity. Again, people that are more skillful players than me may well be able to use that to their advantage. So that's that whole section there now. and obviously we have 2 of those, so I'm now going to go down and explain a few other little bits and pieces here that people may not be aware are in this instrument. Okay, so let's have a look at a few of the other bits and pieces that are around here. As I mentioned before, each one of these 2 lines, so I've got a patch here which takes advantage of both lines. So first of all, we've got a few controls here. Because each one of these is independent, each line can have its own bend range. So at the moment, both lines are set to a 6-note range. So they're obviously going to bend in sync with each other. But if, for instance, I change one of those up to maybe an octave range, and then use the bend effect, quite nice. And obviously the point there is maybe have one of these set to 0 and one set to a bend range. So again, you get some quite interesting effects by using the bend control on the keyboard, but with the different level to each one of the 2 lines. Okay, we have a mono poly switch here, switches between monophonic and polyphonic mode. Now at the moment I don't have a lot of re-triggering options on that. That may well come in a later version of the Arminator, or I may add in some mono triggering options. To the left, this is a rather gimmicky on-off switch which does nothing other than completely mute the instrument. So there we are, silence, and we're back in the room. Okay, so probably more interested in some of the bits and pieces we got down here at the bottom. Now, as I've mentioned before, we have mixers here for the 2 lines, A and B. And we also have pan on each one of the lines, as I mentioned before. One of the things which we may consider adding in the future would be it would be quite nice, I feel, if we could modulate the pan, which would be a relatively straightforward thing to do by adding another LFO possibly, or envelope modulation option. We'll maybe think about adding that in a future version. The 2 other sliders we got here are for the ring modulation area, which we've had a good go at trying to replicate the complexity of the ring modulation area of the original instrument. And the other slightly more gimmicky effect here is bit crusher, which is just put in there to give you a little bit of option to add a bit of horrible graunch to the sound. The bit crusher effect, or the tone of the bit crusher, is set by the control here, and then the level of the bit crusher is set here. So what I'm going to do temporarily is take down the level of both of the lines A and B. So now when I play a note, if you can hear me playing the keyboard there, you'll see that nothing's coming out. I'm going to increase the level of the bit crusher, and then you change the tone of the bit crusher here. On its own, not a particularly pleasant effect unless you like those sort of noises, but of course where this does become useful is if you mix it in subtly with the existing sounds. Just gives a little bit of graunch and busyness to the underlying sound. Okay, so that's the A and B. Let's have a look at, we will have a look at the ring modulator, but before I do that I just want to talk a little bit about the tuning between the 2 oscillators. So let's make sure we've got these levels down and out the way. Now this is another area where you've got a label which is also a control. So you've got the tune of line A, and that can only be affected here in semitone steps. between a plus and minus octave. Okay, but you've also got octave controls down below here as well. Okay, line B tuning control is a little bit different. You do have here a continuous tune, so it's not in steps at all, but you have this another one of these controls here, which is also labels, which is also control. So when in low mode, the range of detuning will be quite subtle. Now, to help you, when you have both oscillators in unison, a little arrow appears just to indicate that you've actually got both oscillators exactly in sync. It's very, very precise. To be honest, anywhere around where that appears, you're going to be fine. In fact, you may prefer to have that slight pitch shift between the two rather than a hard thing. I haven't given the opportunity to lock sync the two oscillators. Again, that may be something we'll consider to put into a version 1.5, because that is sometimes useful to be actually have each line, should I say, syncing exactly to its partner. Okay, so low and high. If I have it in the high mode, then what you'll hear is so again, you can get the two to be in unison even when it's in high mode, but you've got a much higher range of sweep of detune on line B. So obviously you've also got the octave range here, so between the octave up and down here in the higher mode and the octave modes here, you've got quite a large range of adjustments for the tuning between the two lines. Okay, ring modulator, shall I talk about that now? No, I'm next going to talk about this little control here. This is a rather trivial attempt to recreate the pitch bar that used to be, or the modulation bar that was on the original instrument. Now, of course, in a virtual instrument that doesn't make a great deal of sense, because obviously you know, you can use all sorts of external controllers to get the same effect here. But it was an interesting experiment to try and put it into the instrument. At the moment I've got that set to the ring modulation pitch, but I'm going to set that to both the pitch of both oscillators. So if I play a note here now, and it has various modes, so it's got the mode it's in at the moment. It will actually hear you, it moves, moves the pitch to an extremely high range, and it will stay wherever you've left it. So you can obviously use it as a sort of a okay. If we put it in a different mode, and then it's a different mode again. Okay, so although it's on the interface, it would mean using the mouse to control it. I'm not actually sure if you can MIDI learn it. Let's try that. Doesn't look like you can, which is a shame, because what would be really neat would be if you could link that to a MIDI controller. Some of the other controllers on here you are able to MIDI learn. If you see there, I can right click on a control. I have the opportunity to link that to a controller on the instrument. Not with that control, which is rather unfortunate. But having said that, maybe some of the features that allows you to do, you could do on an external MIDI controller anyway. So, ring modulator. Okay, so the ring modulator can affect it has its own internal oscillator, and that internal oscillator can have its pitch altered with the pitch control, and the other input that's modulated, shall we say, that's ring modulated, can either be A line, B line, or a mix of the both. So it's when in the center position, it's a mix of the both, or it can be A and B. Probably easiest to demonstrate this, so if you just wait a moment, I'll try and get this operating. So let's just bring up line B. Okay, so I'm just going to ring modulate that line. Okay, so I'm going to move the modulation to there. I'm going to take the level of line B down, and I'm going to bring up the ring modulator level. Now the ring modulation pitch can be affected by the green slider here. Here at this moment in time, I'm not modulating that signal in any way. Okay, but I do have the opportunity here to use an envelope that's built into the ring modulator, so I can set the attack and decay, for instance, and then I have two controls here. I have the pitch envelope, so that will be using the envelope to control the pitch of the ring modulator. So if I can turn the pitch down there now, turn that pitch up. What you should hear now is a sweep of the pitch that it modulates the line B. But I've also got the volume envelope, so I can also use the envelope to affect the amount of modulation as well. So if I turn down the pitch, now I'm not going to affect the pitch by the envelope, but I'm going to affect the amount that the modulation effect occurs. A subtly different effect from the pitch modulation. And lastly, I can also affect the pitch by the velocity. So I'll turn down the thing, turn up the pitch a little tiny bit, make sure that they're all down. Now that ring modulator again on its own is quite a startling effect, but again can then be mixed in with the output of the normal oscillators as well. Fair to say the ring modulator on the original instrument, if we're not going to kid ourselves what instrument this one is based upon, was very much part of its signature sound. My success at trying to recreate the ring modulator has been part. I wouldn't say I've fully managed to do it, it's only been in part. But of course the thing is that we're trying to capture the essence of the instrument here. So the ring modulator I've created here is a little bit unique, a little bit different. It's got some controls that you may not find in other VSTIs, but it certainly is able to add a bit of colour to the sound. Much like the normal oscillators, of course, you can also affect the pan of the ring modulator as well. Okay, lastly in this section we have the reverb. Fairly standard four controls on the reverb. The size of the room from small to large. The width of the reverb effect, bearing in mind that the whole of the output stage of Arminator is in stereo. So you can sort of make the reverb a narrow effect in the middle of the stereo field, or effect in both channels. The damping, so you can actually have the effect that the room has more soft furnishings in it. Actually, well, let me turn the ring modulator off. It's quite hard to do the effect with that on. Just gives it a denser, richer sound when the damp is up. And the mix. Um, the last little section that's just probably worth mentioning is the patch control area here. You've got the ability to step between patches with the right and left arrow keys. You can edit the name of a patch. You can copy patches from one location to another, load banks, load patches, or save patches and save banks. Obviously, the first version of Arminator comes with an excellent set of patches from Armin Kojashi, which is, I think we're all pretty clear on the Vangelis sound that he's managed to capture with this instrument. There is another patch bank on its way if it's not already arrived by the time you view this video, and I'm hoping that perhaps some other people contribute some other patches which are maybe in a slightly different genre, because I think this instrument is more than just a Vangelis stroke CSAT sound alike. So it has some unique features which other people may be able to find a use for as well. That's pretty much it for the Arminator. I don't think there's anything here I've missed. Hopefully this little set of tutorials, or this tutorial, has been useful to you. By all means, like it in the like section below if you do, and of course don't forget to visit the Krakli Plugs Facebook group if you aren't already a member, because there's the ability to download all of the Krakli history, or as much of it as I've been able to retrieve in terms of plugins. So if you've got any old projects, they'll be rescued by finding one of the old plugins that you may have lost along the way. But there's new stuff coming out all the time as well. So it's all free. We'll always continue to release Krakli plugins free. That's just the way we roll. And but by all means engage on the Facebook group if that's your thing, because it's quite a healthy group. At the last look, it was over 2,000 members, and a good number of those are active members on the group. So there's a lot of conversations and lots of things going on there which are not just totally related to Krakli plugins. There's some other little branches of interest that we go down occasionally as well. So it's a good friendly bunch, and some helpful and useful people on there as well. So thank you for watching. As I say again, if you liked it, like it, and see you soon.